I think to understand my work, it may be useful to take a step back and let me explain to you a little bit about the way that the economics discipline has evolved. So if you go back to sort of classical economics, there is a very sort of simple view of the world. Individuals are perfectly rational, they are self-interested, and they are maximizing their utility. The firm is essentially a single unit. You're not really thinking too much about what's happening within the firm. And individuals and firms are interacting in the market. It is a perfectly competitive market. I think over the last decades, this sort of view of economics has changed quite a lot. People realize that markets don't always function perfectly. There are imperfections, particularly in developing economies. And one sort of response to these market imperfections is for communities rather than individuals to come in and try to sort of reduce these market imperfections, information problems or commitment problems in one way or the other. And that has really been the focus of my research. My work is grounded in empirical facts. I will typically look at real phenomena, real institutions, and then try to use economic theory to try to understand them and link them back to the sort of more general question about the development process. The other particular feature of my work is the focus on communities and trying to understand how individuals within these communities make decisions and how this aggregates up to the community level. I think that anyone who has spent time in a developing country knows the importance of communities, the importance of social connections. And I think for me, this was one of the primary motivations for my research program. And so what these community networks do in some way is to reduce frictions in developing economies. Now, one of the features of my work has been to sort of show how these networks can facilitate economic activity. But the other side is that these same networks, once they are in place, can also lead to distortions of their own. And so they can sometimes, for example, restrict mobility. They can result in the misallocation of resources. And I've tried to sort of have a sort of balanced perspective on what these community institutions can do in the process of development. And so it's really important to understand this as a dynamic process of network formation and then ultimately of network decay as the economy sort of changes or goes through stages of development. And ultimately, this links up from the micro level to the macro level. Now, to develop a theory of this kind of process that is robust, you want it to be, we want also to have some kind of external validity. And so my early work on this was based in India, based on caste networks. But I'm now doing work, for example, in China, looking at the evolution of private enterprise. Networks in China are organized very differently. They organize around a hometown, not around kinship units. But the same theoretical framework can be used to explain the evolution of the Chinese economy over time. And in some ways, it's very different from the evolution of the Indian economy, precisely because the underlying social structure is different. And that gives rise to different network structures, which in turn give rise to different development dynamics. I have a research project on the diamond industry in India. This is an industry that most Indians know about, but actually know very little about because it is so secretive. And in India, there were two traditional business communities, the Palampuris and the Marwadis, who basically kind of organized the business end of this industry. And there was a third community known as the Kathiawardis, who were in charge of the cutting and the polishing, the labor side. What was interesting to me as a development economist was a supply shock in the late 1970s, which allowed some of these Kathiawardis, who were at that point, had pretty close relations with the Palampuri businessmen, to move into the business side of the industry. And over the subsequent 20 years, they brought in hundreds of members of their community into business. And so this is, I think, a beautiful example of how networks, community networks, can actually support mobility. What you have is a historically disadvantaged community that is actually able to make the transition first from agricultural labor, then to industrial labor, and then to large-scale export, international export over the course of a single generation. Using theory in social science research, in economics research, particularly empirical research, is in some ways more challenging than using theory, for example, in physics. And this is because the world that you are studying is constantly changing. There is sort of a fine balance. You want to develop a theoretical model that is sensitive to the particular situation that you are studying, but which is still general enough to give you a framework which you can carry from one research project to the next. So when I start a new project, I have already in place a machinery which I can take to the next project. And I think this is important because of the changes in development economics over the last 15 or 20 years. I think for me this prize was especially important because it told me that my work had been recognized in India. I have spent most of my research career working on India, and I often felt that my work was less visible in that country. I think what this tells me is that I was wrong, and that people did actually notice, and that they did appreciate what I was trying to do. And I think it really meant a lot to me to hear that.